Okay, beautiful people. Digital Foundry always makes some really nice content for us people, and today we are reacting to Watch Dogs Legion Xbox Series X ray tracing versus PC RTX. Showing some feature, quality and performance. So let's watch the video together and let's react to the amazing content that Digital Foundry provides.
Next Gen is here, and we have our first ray tracing title with Watch Dogs Legion that I will be putting under the microscope. In this ray tracing analysis video, I will be examining the ray tracing on Xbox Series X and Series S to show what it brings to the table over what we see on Xbox One X. I'll also investigate how it stacks up against the PC.
They should do also PS5. Why no PS5?
Settings
Why?
on PC to show what type of GPU offers that same Xbox Series X experience or better. And I think we'll see some interesting results here through this analysis. Sadly, I don't have a PS5 to test in time for this video, but based upon what I'll describe later in the video, what we're seeing on Series X here is going to apply very similarly to PS5. So what are we getting here exactly with ray tracing on console in Watch Dogs Legion? As mentioned in my PC review of the game, the ray tracing in Watch Dogs Legion is used for reflections and replaces the standard system of screen space reflections combined.
Like, to me, it looks really good. Like, for someone who has got a PC without ray tracing, like this, the Xbox Series X will be like a good choice instead of upgrading my PC, because I have to upgrade my GPU, my CPU, and I think my motherboard as well. So, £445, it's way cheaper than buying like a proper PC right now. Maybe in like 1 year, 1 year and a half, I can upgrade and buy a 3090 or something like that. Probably it's gonna be cheaper. Who knows?
With real-time Q maps. The ray traced reflections on Series S and X combine with SSR to increase performance and
the game looks good, like really good.
Legion. So the reflection of a puddle on the ground.
The game looks sick.
Will, for example, show reflective properties when it's reflected in a reflection. Unlike Spider-Man as well, the geometry in reflections looks to be the exact same level of detail and precision as those in the primary view. So objects and reflections do not have...
Even the hair of this guy looks like they are well done. Like, this generation is the generation of furs and nice hair.
More obvious polygon edges than they otherwise would, or things like the edges of windows in buildings show up in RT reflections.
This guy looks like... what's the name of the grime rapper? Fuck. Stormzy. If you look, he's got like a shape, face shape that is similar. Even the beard.
RT reflections, albeit with a limited range like the rest of the game's ray traced reflections. This is something I'll talk about later in the video.
So it plays with ray tracing at 30 frames per second, right? And without ray tracing 4K 60 frames per second. So there's going to be differences
in the RT implementation in different games, but there will be similarities as well. Watch Dogs on Series S and X also uses stochastic reflections like in Spider-Man, so they will technically produce more realistic surface reflections than other types of ray tracing. Like in Spider-Man as well, the ray traced
this door looks weird. Like, I don't like the iron and stuff like that. It was a bit weird.
Realistic, especially in comparison to those that you could see on Xbox One X where there's no ray tracing used. When you compare side by side, it's easy to see big differences thanks to ray tracing and Watch.
Let's see the big difference. Let's see. Okay, yeah, Xbox One X looks like a bit plain, like without, like the mirror, the glass doesn't look like glass. On Series S it looks already good. Like, you can see a different kind of depth, and the Series X it looks better than the Series S. I wonder how does it look on PC.
Watch Dogs Legion. In those views where screen space reflections cannot add much to the image, Like this puddle on the ground here in the beginning of the game, we can see how Xbox Series X and S add in perfectly perspective correct reflections, whereas Xbox One X just has a cube map that doesn't really align with that which is actually on screen. In other scenes though, the benefits that ray tracing has on Xbox Series consoles can be smaller due to the angle of the camera view. For example, in this shot down the alley, here the camera is parallel to the ground more or less, so a lot of objects in a larger portion of the reflective surfaces in this shot look
like the Xbox One X version it looks alright, like could be faked. The reflection could be faked, and on Xbox Series X and S is more realistic. You see the other flags and a bit of the building. The bus on the Series X, you can see the puddle at the end has got like some red from the Remember Tone Victims ban. I don't know if you can read it, but you can see the red at the end of Series X puddles.
SSR. But if you look at those areas on the ground where the reflection would be off screen, it's easy to see how much better reflections look on Series X and S, where Xbox One X is just using low resolution cube maps. The ray tracing difference between generations is largest when looking directly at mirror-like surfaces, like this darkened glass facade of a
Xbox
building.
One X is like
here in front of the
nothing.
On Xbox
Series
S, you can see the
school is alright.
behind the camera,
Series X is
our own
good.
character model. There's a lamppost in view, and we can see all the textures of the sidewalk and street, including reflective puddles on the ground near our character model, which is also reflected. On Xbox One X, the real-time cube map reflections are used instead from this angle, as screen space reflections can see nothing here. Firstly, the resolution is rather low in that cube map reflection, and the building in that reflection is just a facsimile simplification of the real buildings in the area. It has a completely different facade and texture set, and it is very simplified. And of course, none of the finer detail is there, and no dynamic objects are rendered in the reflection.
Digital Foundry is becoming like the standard of video game reviews and
not too bad.
detail
Right,
analysis.
the caveat that the cube map reflections in Watch Dogs Legion only look like this in stills. When you move around, the cube map reflection is generating in real time with your camera movement in small bits with great time lag. So on Xbox One X, you can see that cube map reflection shifting and
Yeah, it looks weird.
really oddly as the camera moves. Unlike ray traced reflections, which are always real time and always perspective correct, on top of all the other advantages they would have. As I see
Realistic. This is realistic, is well done.
Next-gen consoles, as London is a city with a lot of metal and glass and reflective materials where the difference of RT reflections shows off well. It also helps quite a bit that London is a very rainy place in this game. So how exactly is this possible, and what compromises are made? When I did my PC review of this game, even with my optimized settings, an RTX 2060 Super was managing just slightly above 30 FPS with ray tracing set to the lowest setting of medium at my optimized settings at 1440.
So now he's gonna tell us what kind of GPU like compares to the Xbox Series X.
I have a great ace up my sleeve. Thanks to seasoned Watchdog modders who have been tinkering with this game engine since 2014, I know exactly what settings both these machines are running at and their exact differences in comparison to PC settings, as well as those settings for the PS5. Essentially, the PC game ships with configuration files for each console and each graphical preset on PC. And these configuration files go way beyond the granularity exposed in the graphics menu found on PC. And looking at these configuration files and doing the comparison, it's possible to see that compromises on Xbox Series X and S and PS5 are used to make the ray tracing possible. It's also possible to see that Xbox Series X
quality,
and PS5 run at
ID,
exactly
resolution
the same
X.
So consoles do a lot behind the scenes to turn off things not found in the PC games menu, like turning off headlight shadows on cars, using quarter resolution global illumination, reduced shadow settings, and they apparently don't use the high resolution texture pack that is found on PC. On top of other settings optimizations,
but it looks really close.
But there are two big ways RT is made possible on Xbox Series X and S and PS5. The first is dynamic resolution scaling, which is not available on PC. On Xbox Series X, it outputs at 4K, but uses dynamic resolution to scale down to a 0.66 value using the in-game metric, which is just about 1440p. In many quieter scenes in the game on Xbox Series X, the game can read native 4K actually, or slightly below it in other scenes at around 90%. But when you get outside in the nighttime, for example, with a lot of cars and reflective surfaces, or you race through a level really quickly, the game's resolution will drop closer to a 1440p minimum. On Series S, the game outputs at 1080p, and the resolution scaler can drop down to a 0.83 using the in-game metric, which means down to around
What the fuck? People are not gonna be happy about that.
We saw the resolution scaling a bit more
People
that
buy Xbox Series S, they want 1440p, right?
For RT actually. So ray tracing must be optimized in particular ways only found on the console versions of this game. The first is resolution. Back on PC at ultra settings at launch, I thought the ray tracing was sub-native, with the vertical resolution being half the output resolution. And in fact, that analysis was very close to the truth. Looking through the configuration files, it's possible to see how the game's ray tracing on all platforms uses a checkerboard rendering to achieve its output resolution. So PC medium to ultra all use checkerboarding technically. On Xbox Series X, the checkerboard rendering is used as well, but the ray tracing resolution is actually at an internal fixed resolution of 1920 by 1080, so below the output of 4K. Basically 1080p checkerboarded RT reflections. When you compare the PC version at ultra settings at 4K, this difference in internal resolution for RT is pretty obvious, where reflections lose a lot of their texture detail and material quality as they are softened.
But it's not that obvious, like... You can see the difference, but it's not like, wow, what the fuck.
S, the internal resolution of the reflections is limited to checkerboard.
Like the difference between Series X and S is bigger than Series X with PC
and
Ultra.
Reduces their clarity. In stills, I think this is obvious. In motion though, the difference is that Series X produces a lot more noise and aliasing and flicker in the reflections than are possible to be seen on PC. So like in this scene here with the spider robot, notice how all the reflections have this kind of sparkly look to them that is not found on PC.
Show me on PC. Yeah. You can see the difference, yeah. You can see like the grainy stuff.
On Series S.
The grainy stuff on
Another optimization is to
Xbox Series
reduce
X.
the range of dynamic objects and static objects in the reflections BVH structure. Here Series S and X and as a result PS5
Maybe with
use the exact same reflection distance as medium
like as
on the
time
PC.
goes by, developers are gonna be able to find a better solution to create a reflection.
Much closer to the camera.
I think this is early
so you will
stage.
see essentially a greater level of pop-in.
But for sure, PC always gonna be better than console.
You would see at the higher settings on PC. Other optimizations found on the Series consoles are that particles are not shown in reflections on Series X and S, like the high setting on PC, and projected decals are missing on Series S, like on the medium setting on PC. But there are other further optimizations as well, like the SSR quality for RT reflections being lower than the lowest medium setting on X and S, as well as the ray distance being the same as medium on Series X and S, and the ray decay for rougher reflections being most similar to PC's high on Series X and PC's medium on Series S. But the biggest optimization beyond their internal resolution is the roughness cutoff on console. Basically, on Series S and X, the rougher materials in the scene like duller metals, marbles, polished tiles, and the like do not receive ray-traced reflections, and instead fall back to cube maps more readily. So in scenes like this one in the subway station, more subtle, duller reflections are missing on the Series S and X, like the dull metal of the turnstile here, which is missing reflection on both consoles, or how the tiles on the ground are lacking much of the reflections found on PC, and same with the tiled walls reflecting the light fixtures. On PC, there's no difference in roughness cutoff between the settings, so consoles here are below the lowest medium setting in this important aspect.
Well, what kind of GPU are we talking about? PC medium 4K.
As it affects
what
the quality
GPU
of
is
the game's
that?
materials. This type of optimization, though, is one that I imagine that will be more common on this generation of consoles, as the rougher surfaces are, the more randomly light bounces off of it, and the more expensive ray tracing becomes. If you reduce the amount of rougher surfaces that have ray tracing applied to them, you not only save on processing time, but you also can spend those same rays that you saved in a much cheaper way on mirror reflections and making them look a little better. This is an area I would like to
you can see the pipes, they look like amazing on PC and
for
good
ray
on
tracing,
Xbox.
they're lower than those available on PC.
Well, on
which
PC
would
they were like really
see how these settings would run on
nice.
PC. But thanks again to modders, we can actually apply all these custom console settings to run on PC. And they work perfectly there. Although dynamic resolution won't work there, and there are slight differences in the image.
So it's compared to a 2060 Super.
Here, where I'm running Series X settings on a PC with an RTX 2060 Super and a Core i5-8400. Notice how the resolution of the ray traced reflections is the exact same here in the RTX 2060 Super shot as it is on Series X. This is something not at all possible to do with the settings in the game menu. Or notice how this shot of the subway that we looked at earlier has the same roughness cutoff on the RTX 2060 Super as it has on Series X. Another thing not at all possible using the in-game settings menu. But it's not perfect, as Xbox Series X settings on PC seem to be higher or have more coherent reflections than those found on Xbox Series X. Like if you zoom in here, you can see a tiny blue line of a coherent reflection on the turnstiles. Also notice how much higher res the UI elements on the turnstiles are, and also notice how the mirror-like reflections in the glass look unfiltered on Series X, while those Series X settings on PC look smoothed over and filtered. Or in this shot here, you can notice how there's quite a lot less noise in the reflections on the Xbox Series X settings on PC than we see on Xbox Series X itself. These are great near exact approximations, but they're technically higher, so we have to keep that in mind for this comparison. Anyway, let's see how these slightly higher settings
This makes me think about
4K next to the
waiting
Series
and
X.
buying a
To do that, I
computer,
found an area of the
upgrading
game
my
where I saw the
PC.
Xbox Series X having a countable resolution below native 4K.
Yeah,
So this scene
2060
here is what
Super,
I
I
chose.
don't think it's
In this
that
scene, I could
expensive.
count a
How much
perfect
is that?
94
400
pixels out of
pounds?
100 on the Series X, meaning a 0.94 resolution modifier in the options. That means Series X has to drop resolution ever so slightly here to get 30 FPS. So this is a GPU limited scene. Loading up that exact same scene on the RTX 2060 Super at native 4K with no resolution scaling, it's possible to see how the RTX 2060 Super gets 32 FPS in this scene at stock clocks. So it is running above 30 FPS at a higher resolution than the Xbox Series X. So for this scene at least, the RTX 2060 Super is extremely comparable in GPU performance to that which is found on Xbox Series X. Actually, I'd even say that the RTX 2060 Super here is doing better than the Xbox Series X by quite a bit, considering the ray traced reflections on it are actually higher. Just walking around the game world, it's possible to see how the RTX 2060 Super is pretty okay at getting above 30 FPS at native 4K at Xbox Series X settings. And just like Series X though, it would need DRS to make sure it always gets a consistent 30 FPS, especially in the open world. But here we're getting to the end of our analysis, which has some interesting conclusions. First, I think it shows that consoles may scale differently with ray tracing. Consoles may use lessened resolutions, distances, or material settings than those found in the PC versions of games. Secondly, it shows us that the performance scales differently than we might have expected when ray tracing is used. Without ray tracing, Gears 5 on Series X was a bit below an RTX 2080 when we looked at it earlier this year. In this game, with ray tracing, it's more similar to an RTX 2060 Super. So perhaps ray tracing is pound for pound more expensive on consoles. But still, we're looking at an early generation title here, and things may change over time.
Yeah, probably
Likewise,
things are gonna
that's a
change.
bit contrived and
But
academic,
still.
as there's absolutely no reason why a user would want to run native 4K with an RTX 2060 Super at these console settings. The same user could just run higher settings with better RT reflections by using DLSS. But in spite of these unrealistic preconditions of this testing, I find it incredibly enlightening, and I really wish developers would expose console settings explicitly more often on PC. It would be great for our analyses, as well as be great for users who just want a console-like experience and not have to think about graphical settings. That is enough from me for now. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.
Yeah,
If
this
you're already
video was
subscribed,
amazing, man.
Please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as
1
soon as
million
Digital Foundry posts a video.
subscribers.
If you
That's
want to
so
help us
good.
out, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Watch Dogs Legion on console here with ray tracing, write a comment below or follow me in Digital Foundry on Twitter.
Okay, so what did we learn? We learned that console are good, are really good. Well, for the money, they are really a good deal, but in the end, the PC is gonna always be the master race. That is easily upgradable, even if it's expensive, and the performance on PC, it's better. That's what we learn. But Xbox Series S is a really, and PS5 are a really good entry point in the ray tracing era of video game, because if not, you would have to spend some money on a new GPU, and ray tracing GPU are I don't know how much is a 2060, but I think a 2060 is, let me see, Nvidia 2060 Super is 300. You can find it for 350, 250, no, 300, from 300 to 400 pounds you can find one, basically. So really good. It's a really good deal to buy Series X and or PS5. Also, if you're no expert and you have to pay someone to upgrade your PC, it's better to buy a console. PC is more practical because you could always upgrade like in 1 year, or you can buy parts like every 6 months and stuff like that. Console is more easy, it's chill, it's like for someone who wants just to game, sit down in the couch and play some games. Anyway, let me know in the comment section, what do you think about ray tracing on console versus ray tracing on PC? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you